How would you rank the 6 serials of Doctor Who Season 17? And if you need a reminder, that's Destiny of the Daleks, City of Death, The Creature from the Pit, Nightmare of Eden, The Horns of Nimon, and Shada. I shared my own personal ranking order in a recent live stream I did, and you're about to see the edited highlights. What is number 6? Actually, let's not bandy about. It's Creature from the Pit, isn't it? Yeah. I enjoyed watching Creature from the Pit as a kid, and I enjoyed rewatching it now. Let's start with a few of the positives, shall we? The jungle setting looks great. Myra Francis is great as Lady Adrasta. What a kind of a Shakespearean villain she is. You know, maybe a tad kind of one note. You know, maybe occasionally the performance could have come down just a little bit in order to then fire back up again. Organ on. The dodgy astrologer, I think he's a great character, played by Jeffrey Baldon, kind of Robert Holmesian actually. Tom Baker and Lalla Ward are having a great time. I think they're pretty funny. Let me tell you the problem with Creature from the Pit, the real problem. I think it's not the monster itself. It's not Erato, this great big green blob that lives underground on the planet Chloris. In the making of documentary, which was on the DVD, I believe, everyone is just flagellating themselves, and in some cases each other, for this monster Erato, and I don't think they should, because I think the real problem is more about script and story, and especially structure. The story of The Creature from the Pit ends at the end of part 3. If you haven't noticed it consciously, then you must have felt it, because good lord. Let's start with this question, right? How many other Doctor Who stories do you see the main villain of the piece on the back foot at the end of part 3 in a 4-part story? Usually at the end of part 3, the main villain is absolutely at their height of their powers, and the Doctor is at the lowest ebb, and everything seems hopeless. You know, obviously the same happens at the end of part 4. But the cliffhanger of part 3 really needs to be proper impending doom, doesn't it? But at the end of part 3 in The Creature from the Pit, Adrasta is beaten. She's like going, no! But when you get to part 4, there's nothing left. Adrasta gets killed in the first 2 minutes. So now the situation is even worse. The main villain is dead. And we've discovered that Erato is pretty cuddly Typhonian ambassador, although Lady Adrasta is the monster really. But that's the problem, yeah. At the start of part 4, the Doctor has basically won. It doesn't have 4 episodes worth of story. It should have been a 3-part story. Let's have a look, see what you've been saying. John says it was one of the first 3 Target books he ever got. Mark Garcia says, I liked Lady Adrasta, always enjoy female villains. Jeremy Duncan says Lady Adrasta is a very memorable performance. I really like parts 1 to 3, but once Myra Francis gets killed off, it's just not the same. David Bull fancies Lady Adrasta. You might not be alone, yeah. I had a bit of a crush on Lady Adrasta. Yeah, it seems like a bit of a consensus might be forming here, Tony. That's a really good point, something I forgot to mention. Yeah, the Wolfweeds are really good. One of the things in the story that always amuses me is the Doctor does his thing and then leaves an astrologer and the Wolfweed guy in charge. Yeah, well actually it's a bit like the end of Revelation of the Daleks, where those 2 sadistic guards end up running the place. You know, what is that all about? Time to move on to the next one. Number 5 for me is Shada. And it's worth giving you the caveat that I've only seen this story once. And I liked it. I really enjoyed it. In fact, it was magical. You know, literally a dream to kind of see like a Tom Baker serial that I'd never seen before. I was really pleasantly surprised by the amount of footage they actually shot. Because, you know, just briefly, for those who don't know, Shada is a 6-part story that was affected by industrial action. It was unfinished. I love the sphere that flies through the air and sort of lands on people's heads and does unmentionable things to them. I love Skagra. He's a pretty good villain. Maybe not the Hat, but you know, he's an interesting villain because he's not like ranting and raving, is he? He's kind of quietly spoken and he's got an actual plan. It was great to see the Krogs pop up in the actual filmed material for about 2 seconds. So it's really nice to see, thank God, that we have that. So we can see sort of how they were realized in the studio. The concept of them is that they're kind of coal-based entities, isn't it, the Krogs? And so in terms of the way they were realized, they kind of end up looking a bit more like mandrels, don't they? You know, they're feel a bit generic, really. Even the name feels like something that Douglas Adams might have just sort of invented in about 5 seconds. If there was a better monster, I think that might have elevated Shada a bit more. As Douglas Adams says himself in one of the makings of, there's not quite enough story for a 6-parter. There's a lot of imagination there and it feels big and we go to a lot of different places, but is there really enough going on? Shada would be my second favourite after City of Death. My personal ranking would probably go Creature, Eden, Nimon, Destiny, Shada, City. Shada ranks high for me mainly because I'm a huge fan of Time Lord lore. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of great concepts. I like that, you know, there's big Time Lord stuff in this, handled sort of quite lightly, really. The 6-part version on this collection, says Tony, is the best version of it I've seen. John Matthews reckons it's impressive how well the jumps from film to animation are handled. Yeah, I did like the CSO fire effect on them. That's one thing that sets them apart. That's a good point. Shada is a great end to the season. I feel the season falls flat without it, but City is by far my favourite. Number 4 it's Nightmare of Eden. There's a mandrel there for you. Nightmare of Eden is an unusually challenging serial, especially for that sort of period of Doctor Who. And it's kind of challenging in two ways, you know, conceptually and thematically. Writer Bob Baker starts off by smashing two spaceships together, and they kind of blend in a weird kind of multi-dimensional fashion. That's a pretty good concept, isn't it? What do we think about the way that the new optional special effects on Nightmare of Eden make that moment and that concept more understandable? I mean, I think they do a bit. I really, as I've said before, I love optional special effects, and I think they're really good on Nightmare of Eden this time on this season 17 set. So that's pretty cool. And then thematically, the Nightmare of Eden it's about drugs, isn't it? Kind of. You know, that's pretty unprecedented in Doctor Who. You have like the captain of the ship high on Vrax Owen and laughing his head off, and in an incredibly dark moment, which is probably one of the best pieces of black humor in the history of Doctor Who, the captain is laughing his head off as his passengers on this vessel are mauled to death by the mandrels. The story is kind of your classic, or your typical, your archetypal monsters on a spaceship story, isn't it? It's a base under siege story, and I am always here for that sort of thing. But the mandrels get a bit of a kicking, and they also on the behind the sofa, you know, that's new on the season 17 Blu-ray set. The mandrels get a right old kicking, but all I can say that as a kid, I loved them. Let me give you evidence of that. This is a book that I drew and created back when I was a kid. And you can see the mandrel there. Look at that incredible description of them. These roaring monstrosities. That's not a bad word for a rather young child. These roaring monstrosities are brown, have green eyes, and roar like anything. They roar like anything, I tells you. Tom's performance in Nightmare of Eden often gets a bit of stick, doesn't it? In fact, quite a lot of stick. And it's kind of received wisdom, I suppose, that Tom was just out of control in season 17 and just doing whatever he liked and kind of making light of all the stories. Well, it's just not the case. The moment in Nightmare of Eden when the Doctor steps into Eden and is chased in a Pied Piper fashion by a troop of mandrels, and then he cries out, "My arms, my legs, my everything." That's not taking the story incredibly seriously. Although Tom Baker is one of my favourite people in the universe, and so I'm kind of tempted to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that if the Doctor was off camera and there was terrible sounds and the viewers, young viewers, knew the monsters were there with him off camera, then they might be imagining the Doctor being torn to pieces, and so maybe he felt the need to kind of play it down a bit. Well, you know, a lot. Yeah, on the sort of the more negative side of Nightmare of Eden, it does have very much kind of Warriors of the Deep syndrome, very brightly lit studios, doesn't it? And the mandrels, especially towards the end, they're not being filmed in a very scary way. So yeah, that's not so great, I must admit. But mandrels are cool. A bit like Bow Ties. It's one of the more gritty shows, if you can call it that, the classic series ever did. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's hard drug use. Yeah. Blair Who says the new effects help the story a lot, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, they certainly don't hurt. Dario108 says new effects were better but not amazing. Jason Fisher says, how can anyone not love a mandrill? They have flares. They so do. The whole drug smuggling storyline was fascinating. It's a simple story in many ways, but there were some amazing concepts that are really ahead of their time. Yeah. John Matthew says, I'll always watch the stories in their original form, but if new effects bring more people to enjoy classic Doctor Who, then it can only be a good thing. I served David Dacre many years ago at work. He looked like he was still in Vraxo in rehab. That good, eh? That good. Jeremy Duncan says, I just wish the mandrels were shot in less bright surroundings. Absolutely, yeah. John Matthew says, did you ever use the phrase roar like anything in any of your Kerrang reviews? Yes, I probably did. Yes, on this Motorhead album, Lemmy roars like anything. The Eyes of the Mandrels by Jason Arnopp coming soon to a telly near you. Well, maybe Fisk had taken a bit of Vrax Owen by mistake, and so he was getting confused as to people's names. Nightmare is a story to revisit when one is older to appreciate the underlying themes of the episode. Absolutely right, Mark. I'm going to move on to number 3, Destiny of the Daleks. Yes, it's got its faults, and I'll talk about a few of those now, as well as the good stuff. But it's got, you know, it's got the Daleks and Davros in it, hasn't it? Eh? It's not a classic story, but it does have a load of good stuff in it. It's a typical sort of Terry Nation story in a way, with kind of the Daleks with an opposing tribe, the Movellans. You know, the Movellans are pretty cool. I like the way they turn out to be robots, and they're very sort of 80s. They look very much like an 80s band, don't they, with their very clean white uniforms. And I also like the concept of the Daleks being sort of trapped in a logic war. David Goodison as Davros. I've said before that I'm not so keen on Goodison's performance, but I mean, looking back on it now, it's just different, isn't it? You know, and it's maybe not, there's not as much energy there as you might expect from you know, as you certainly expected from Michael Wisher, who played Davros in Genesis of the Daleks. But A, Goodison was kind of constricted by a mask, and there was a lot of other things that kind of were working against him. And I think he does a good performance. I think he's a good enough Davros. If you haven't ordered season 17, by the way, and you'd like to, there's a link downstairs, as you would expect, in the video description. I think one of the issues with Destiny of the Daleks is that the Daleks aren't as terrifying as they usually are, and I think some of that might be down to the direction and possibly the script as well. Now, one thing springs to mind: the end of episode 1. That should have been a really terrifying cliffhanger, and it kind of isn't really, is it? I like the way the Daleks smash through the wall, or the glass. That's really good to confront and trap Romana. But one thing I don't like about that particular cliffhanger, I'm pretty sure the Daleks state there that they're not going to exterminate her, they're going to imprison her. And what a tension killer for the cliffhanger. One thing I love about Destiny is the soundtrack. The composer has said that he kind of went less for music than atmosphere, and I think the atmosphere is absolutely spot on. But I think the main problem with Destiny, when I look at it as a whole, is it never quite gets going. It's kind of a bit sort of bitty, isn't it? It's sort of there's exciting bits and there's cool bits and there's Davros, Daleks with bombs, that's good. But I think it's quite telling that the most exciting sequence is when the Doctor holds Davros hostage, holding the bomb. There's a stalemate between the Doctor and the Daleks. Imagine if the story had ended with that, because that's the most tense moment of the lot. It's not in the same league as Genesis of the Daleks, but I think it's a pretty good sequel to it. Yeah, my absolute earliest memory of Who is the exploding Daleks from Destiny. Yeah, those explosions are pretty good, actually, I think. Oh, hold on a minute, there's proper modulation for Davros. Can you hear that modulation without a 5.1 sound mix? That's my question to you all. Yeah, you can hear it without a fancy setup. I watch most stuff with a pair of 20 quid headphones, but you'll be able to hear it straight out of the TV. I'm excited now. I'm totally gonna have to watch Destiny of the Daleks again. Destiny of the Daleks was my first Dalek story at age 3, and I've been told I was scared of their voices because I didn't like loud noises. Age 3, I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, a lot of little kids don't, do they? They're quite easily startled, and so unless of course it's them who's shouting their head off, in which case they think that's fine. The opening scene in that quarry were filmed in a place called Windspit Quarry, which I visited a lot on holiday before realising it featured in the story. I used to cosplay the Marytown Romana. I would imagine if you were going to wear a costume of Romana's, you would choose her Reboss operation, big white fleecy coat, would you? Let me show you the number 2 story. 3, 2, 1. Nimon! Look at that Nimon there. I love the Nimon. I don't care what anyone says. I don't think most people hate them, really. I mean, maybe I'll find out in the chat. Nimon is so cool. They were perfect to draw for kids because you basically just sort of drew a bull's head. It's an interesting one because Horns of Nimon is fairly widely seen as quite a bad story, I suppose. But I disagree. I loved it as a kid immediately. I love the whole labyrinth thing. I think the one thing I would change is that about the maze is that the maze is really boring. It's kind of 70s beige, isn't it? The beige maze. It's the kind of story that can very easily capture a child's imagination. I love the idea of the Nimons sort of going around the universe like locusts and draining the life out of planets and leaving them as a husk. Graham Crowden is also great as Soldeed. I mean, yes, he's hamming it up outrageously. It's ludicrous, but it's funny as well. I mean, I love the scene where the Doctor visits Soldeed in Soldeed's office. Soldeed has an office and they have a great chat, and Soldeed is just very funny. I think it's very funny. Horns of Nimon is not boring. I'd defy anyone to say it's boring, but also sometimes it's really hard to separate nostalgia from sort of objective criticism. But guess what? You don't have to. You don't have to. If you love something for whatever reason, then that love is just valid forever. First of all, let's hear which Romana costume Francine Hibiscus wore in cosplay. Glamorous gown, actually, although I did have the puffy coat. The Nimon be praised. Nothing roars like a Nimon. Absolutely. That's another thing. I love the Nimon's voices. Sam Fowler says, nothing will ever be as good as the Slitheen. But the Nimons are one of my favourite characters ever, really. Oh, awesome, Sam. I'm glad you're with me on that. Have to be honest, Nimon is my least favourite of season 17 by some way. And yeah, I can totally understand that. One downside of Nimon that I meant to, the Horns of Nimon that I meant to mention there, is that in terms of the atmosphere of it, sound-wise, it feels a bit unfinished. It feels a little bit bare. The Nimon voices are great, but in terms of atmosphere, there's not a lot going on there. Nimon's is awesome because Graham Crowden is phenomenal. Graham Crowden and Malcolm Terrace. Oh yes, Malcolm Terrace, weakling scum. How many Nimons have you seen today? I have seen three Nimons. Lloyd joins me in liking the ever-changing maze. Whether the finished result was great or not, the imagination and ambition on display in Nimon is first class. Yes, indeed. Wildcard in Australia says, I'm back, can't sleep. Anxiety is playing up again. I'm really sorry to hear that. Let's babble on about classic Doctor Who and bathe in the warmth of that whole period. It's a nice thing to do, isn't it? And that's one of the things I want to do with this channel. It's just, I want to make it a nice place for people to come and remember classic Doctor Who and classic horror movies like The Thing and The Evil Dead, and classic scary game books like House of Hell. It's City of Death, isn't it? Look at that pixelated Jaggeroth there. Well, Scaroth of the Jaggeroth. What a scary character he is. Now, here's the funny thing. About 9 months ago, when season 17 got announced, I made my usual kind of announcement video, and the title of that was Season 17 Announced, plus my favourite serial, in brackets, you know, it's not City of Death. And at the time, I kind of, you know, I didn't believe it was City of Death. I wasn't just saying that for clickbait purposes. Having revisited City of Death, I always knew I liked it, but having revisited that, unless you're going solely on nostalgia value, I think it's very hard to argue that City of Death is not the finest of the serials here. Scaroth of the Jaggeroth, aka Count Scarleone, played very well, brilliantly in fact, by Julian Glover, is a great villain, you know, great sort of witty villain. As Count Scarleone, it's kind of like he's in a Pink Panther movie or something, and the Doctor is Clouseau trying to track him down. It manages to be pretty scary, I think, at times. And the end of episode 1, when the Count pulls off his mask to reveal his true Jaggeroth self, is amazing. And, you know, Tom and Lalla are on top form. As actors, they've fallen for each other, and they're in Paris being the Doctor and Romana, and it's just so hard not to kind of get caught up in the joie de vivre and the novelty of Doctor Who on location. It's just a joy, isn't it? And then there's Douglas Adams using time travel so well. I think that's a really strong cliffhanger when the Doctor goes back in time and Count Scarleone is there again under a different name. It's got one of the most disturbing moments in Doctor Who history for me. Professor Kerensky's death at the end of part 3, I think, is really grim. A lot of the time when a supporting character gets killed in Doctor Who, I think a lot of the time they get told to kind of play it down and make it not too horrific. But Kerensky is kind of like twisting around like this and sort of warped and like in real pain. But, you know, obviously that means I love it because I'm a horror guy, and chances are you're a horror person too if you're looking at this channel. All the cliffhangers are great. And I think one of the things that really elevates City of Death above so many other serials is that Scaroth is vulnerable, you know, and we kind of see that vulnerability. You know, it's like he's coming apart at the seams, isn't it, in those later episodes? You know, we see him kind of really struggling to keep it together. Yeah, I think that was a master touch there from Douglas Adams, and also so well played by Julian Glover, because he could have played that differently as well. One of the true greats, definitely top 5 material for me. I just love the scene when Tom meets the Count for the first time. You can see Tom is having the time of his life. Peak Doctor Who. Wish they'd used time travel more in episodes. It works so well in episodes like City and Evil of the Daleks. Yeah. Yes, Mark. Yeah, this is the one that has John Cleese at the end. What do we think about that? That's an interesting kind of little cameo. I don't think it sort of spoils the tone of it, really. I think that's okay. It's a bit indulgent, but it's also because John Cleese was filming Fawlty Towers at the time, he looks exactly like Basil Fawlty, and so it's a weird kind of world mash, isn't it? You can imagine that the 4th Doctor is somehow meeting Basil Fawlty. Alan H says, poor Kerensky just wanted to be an inventor, wrong place at the wrong time. I know, and he wanted to help the planet, didn't he? The whole I like concise answers exchange between the Doctor and Scarleone is brilliantly constructed. Yeah, the Doctor staying at Fawlty Towers, says Dino. You have hit on something there, Jason. Start writing it. Yeah, there we go. I'm gonna knock out that script by midnight. If you'd like to watch the full 2.5-hour version of that stream, then I've got it archived for you. You can watch it right here, or you might want to watch other stuff on the screen. Either way, thanks for watching, and don't forget to embrace your obsession.